Does your player game object transition strangely, jump around in position when transitioning from playable state to cutscene and then back to a playable state? You'll notice that in my cutscene, the player walks forward near the guards, but then after the cutscene ends and I regain playable control, he's way back here before the trigger. There's that clear jump in space and time. If that is something that you face and struggle with, I want to walk you through how I fix this. I'm going to get out of play mode here, and I'm going to show you how the scene is set up first and foremost. So I do have, I'm going to turn on the mesh for my trigger. So here's a bird's eye view of the scene. I have the playable character. I have the mesh that triggers the beginning of the cutscene, and I also have a second playable mesh, or I should say a cutscene mesh. It's a copy of the player character that is used in the playable controller. So why do I have two of these? Well, this mesh is used within the controller that is walks around and interacts with the world using WASD. The cutscene mesh has no controller on it whatsoever. In fact, there are no components other than an animator, and this animator is controlled via timeline. You can see that I have on this playable, or I should say on this cutscene mesh, I have a walk animation and an idle animation. The purpose of this second mesh is to exist for only the cutscenes. It's not visible in the game during any playable state. You can see that it literally exists only to walk forward and to idle at the end. So let's talk about how I transition from one to the other first and foremost. You can see that I have the player back here, and then the cutscene guard is up here. I'll just go ahead and leave him on so we can visualize it. So when the timeline begins, two things happen, or I should say a series of things happen. Utilizing on a signal emitter on the very first frame of the timeline. This signal emitter does three tasks. It deactivates the visibility of the playable mesh character. It turns on the visibility of the cutscene mesh, and it also deactivates the player control input for the playable mesh. The reason why I do this third task is that when the cutscene begins, I don't want the player to have any input whatsoever. I just want them to sit back, watch the scene, and that's it. So those are the three things that happen at the very first frame of timeline, when we enter timeline. And at the end of timeline, the same things happen in reverse. We turn the visibility of the game object back on for the playable mesh, that's this guy here. We turn off the visibility for the cutscene mesh, this guy here, and we give the player control over the player controller once again. So now that we have an overview of how this scene is set up, I'm going to turn off the cutscene mesh character. I'm going to turn off the visibility by doing so in the inspector. I am going to turn off the visibility of the mesh renderer for the cutscene trigger. And I'm going to step into a flow graph, which I have placed on the cinematic trigger itself. So you can see that on the cinematic trigger, we have a flow machine, and this flow machine is right here. So the way that I'm triggering the cutscene is that on trigger enter, I look to make sure that the object entering the trigger is the player by comparing tags. So game object compare tag. If it's player, then we perform an action if that is true. So if it is the player, we branch out to a true state and we play the timeline. That's what's happening here. Now, disconnect this really quick. So that's what happens there. That's how we enter the trigger, start the cutscene. But how do we prevent the player from jumping back in space or forward or off to some random side? Well, the way that I've done this, gone about this, is using a wait command with a delay that matches the duration of the timeline. So you can see that I have a delay of 7.25 seconds. The reason why I have 7.25 seconds is that in my timeline, that is how long my cinematic is. 7.25 seconds. So I came into timeline, I found its duration, went into my flow graph using Bolt Visual Script, and I entered 725. Now, that means that everything that follows is going to happen exactly when the timeline ends. So the actions that are happening are this. We are going to find the game object with the tag of player, which is this guy here. We are going to set the position, and of what? What are we setting the position of? We are setting the position of the player controller, which is this guy here. And these are variable. These blue units are variables, which I have already predefined here in this list. So at the end of the timeline, we are finding the game object with the player tag, and we are setting the position of the player controller, which is this. Now, what are we setting the position to? Well, I'm setting it to the position, whatever the current position happens to be, of my cutscene mesh, which I also have stored as a variable. So with just these 4 units here, as soon as the timeline ends, wherever this character happens to be, it's automatically going to be transported to the location of where the cutscene mesh ends. These additional units, these 4 here at the end, do the exact same thing but for the rotation of the character, because I like the rotation. You know, if the cutscene mesh ends facing left, then I want the player to respawn facing the same direction, facing left. So after the set position, I am setting the transform rotation, and I'm setting the transform rotation of the game object, which is the player controller, this one, and I'm setting its rotation to the rotation of the cutscene mesh. So now with all of these active here, I will enter play mode, and we're going to see this in action. So if you remember, at the beginning of the video, we entered the cutscene, and as soon as the cutscene was over, the player regained control of the character somewhere back here, even though the cutscene mesh walked to a position somewhere here closer to the guards. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to trigger the cutscene, and you'll notice I don't have control over the character. The character walks forward close to the guard, and when the cutscene ends, look where we are, exactly where we desire to be. And that's how it's done, using Bolt. So no C# coding is needed, even though Bolt is technically C# code. It's just a visual translation layer. I'm sure there's a more precise term for that. But for someone like me who is more visually inclined, I find Bolt to be incredibly useful. And this is how I accomplished the effect of a seamless transition out of a timeline cutscene back into a playable state and maintained the position of the playable character to be the position of where the cutscene mesh left off. I hope this was helpful to you. It took me a while to learn enough to put these pieces together, and so what I hope is that I have saved you a tremendous amount of time in your own journey, and I thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next video, whenever and wherever that may be.